Hello, welcome to this video. People have been saying in the comments that they would like to see some more videos on jazz. And of course, we have a big following for progressive rock here. So I would like to talk about one of my favourite jazz outfits of all time. And I think this group is a brilliant introduction to jazz if you're a progressive rock fan. And I'll get to that in a minute. This video I'm going to be talking about the Modern Jazz Quartet. When I was a very young boy, my dad was a jazz fan and he would play all sorts of records when I was growing up. And certain jazz groups, because he was a big jazz fan, were really important to my development as a musician later on. People like Dave Brubeck, Jerry Mulligan, Miles Davis, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, Chico Hamilton, and probably more than any other group, the one that my dad listened to the most was the Modern Jazz Quartet. I grew up with this band. In this video I'm going to be taking a very personal view of this band because it's so rooted in my DNA. Right back to before I can remember I've been listening to this band. The Modern Jazz Quartet was formed in 1952. The original lineup was Kenny Clarke on drums, John Lewis on piano, Percy Heath on acoustic bass and Milt Jackson on vibraphone. This group grew out of a group that came together in the Dizzy Gillespie jazz group. John Lewis, very economic player, actually came to sort of prominence within the world of bebop. Kenny Clarke, the drummer, is one of the most important drummers in the history of drumming. He is probably the architect of bebop drumming. Him and possibly Max Roach, but I think Kenny was in even earlier than Max Roach, right at the beginning. He's one of the guys that moved time from sort of the hi-hats in that sort of Joe Jones, Count Basie style of playing over to the ride cymbal, and then freed up the left hand and the bass drum to then react to this new rhythmical sort of language that was coming out of bebop. And I think most people, when they play jazz drums now, that's the way they play, and that really comes from Kenny Clarke. So Kenny Clarke and John Lewis come together in the Dizzy Gillespie group. There's some magic going on. They pull in Percy Heath on bass, and this group starts playing small group performances within the Dizzy Gillespie big band concerts. And they think this is really cool, let's form a band. So in '52 they sign to Prestige Records and they form the Modern Jazz Quartet. Now the Modern Jazz Quartet, I think they're very, very special because of the way they fuse a number of styles, and they fuse these styles together absolutely perfectly. So there's a bebop element there, but there's also a cool jazz. Modern Jazz Quartet are very quiet, they're very economic. There's also a heavy influence of the blues. There's an influence of classical music, especially the sort of contrapuntal sound that you get from Bach. And they weave all those things together. And as the group developed, rather than playing in that style that had come from bebop, where you play the head, then you take a ton of solos, and then you play the head again, John Lewis especially, who I think had a real composer's mind, and he's one of the great composers in jazz history, started to orchestrate and create these structures. They played very quiet, very economically. In the early days when they were playing jazz clubs, they would deliberately play so quiet that the audience noise, everyone chatting in the club, you know, sort of overwhelmed the group, and if the audience didn't listen, they would just sort of walk off stage. But what's very interesting with the Modern Jazz Quartet is they move towards playing in concert halls, forcing the audience to sit down and listen, and they would wear sort of tuxedos, and they really changed, I think, the perception of jazz more than any other group to being a very intellectual, artistic form of music that wasn't some divey club with drug dealers. They moved it away from that. In 1955, Kenny Clarke got really frustrated with the Modern Jazz Quartet, and I think the reason for that was because Kenny Clarke, as I said, is a very innovative, exploratory, improvisatory drummer. He's one of the great drummers, and I think as the band developed this much more sort of a classical-based approach to jazz, he found that restrictive, and so he left in 1955 and Connie Kay came in. Connie Kay is one of my favourite drummers of all time. I'm quite a flashy drummer. I like lots of fills, and I think people really, you know, love that style of drumming. But there's certain drummers that are absolute geniuses in what they don't play, and Connie Kay is one of those drummers. Absolutely fits perfectly with the music. His dynamic control is incredible. So in 55 we now get the classic modern jazz quartet, you know. I think around about 56, 57, they moved to Atlantic Records. They have an incredible relationship with them. Atlantic really supported them with Nesu Yurtgen producing them, and they do a run of really classic albums. If you want to start off getting some modern jazz quartets from the early 50s classic period, I would go for Django, and I would go for the self-titled Modern Jazz Quartet. But I'm not going to be talking about those albums. I'm going to be talking about the albums that I grew up with as a young boy, and the albums that sort of meant a lot to me, right? So the first album I'm going to show you is my favourite album by the Modern Jazz Quartet. It's this one here. And I'm not doing this in sort of order, I'm doing it in sort of my personal order. It's this one here. Right, the last concert, the Modern Jazz Quartet, which I think was made in 1974. On the front we have the empty stage, you can see, and on the back we can see them there, right? So the Modern Jazz Quartet, formed in 52, you get the classic lineup 55, they run through the late 50s, early 60s, they are writing absolute classic tunes, jazz standards, Django, that was written by John Lewis, Bag's Groove that was written by Milt Jackson, Vendôme, a whole bunch of really incredible compositions, and there's some incredible albums there. In 1974, Milt Jackson decided to leave the group over financial reasons, and I think they were touring a lot as well. And so they did this last concert. For me, they were still at the peak of their powers. They hadn't run out. They were such a force. And you need to hear this band live. The control that they have and the beauty, and it's not like what you'd expect from a live gig where it's hot. It's an intense sound. Now, one of the things I love about the Modern Jazz Quartet is the two soloists at the front, which is John Lewis on piano and Milt Jackson. John Lewis is very, very economic. He's very structural in the way he plays. He's much closer to, say, like a Dave Brubeck or a Thelonious Monk, but he's also got a very calm and cool style. He's not florid. He's not that bluesy, but he can play all that stuff. Whereas Milt Jackson has got this effusive, exciting, bluesy, rootsy sound, and he's one of the great vibraphone players. Now, I need to mention this as well. This classic sound of the Modern Jazz Quartet, piano and vibes, drums, double bass, is an absolute beautiful sound, and it's quite unique. You know, there's really three great vibraphonists in the history of jazz. You know, you've got Lionel Hampton with the Benny Goodman group. In the 30s, you've got the Colossus, which is Milt Jackson, and then we've got Gary Burton in the 60s, and I'd like to mention Bobby Hutcherson, and you've got Red Norvo, and there's a whole bunch of people. But Milt Jackson is an absolute genius on the vibraphone. So to have Milt's really exciting, you know, virtuoso sound, bluesy and rootsy, against that, it's a perfect balance, and it means that as much as they are known for being quiet and controlled, they can fire up and they can get really down and dirty. This is an incredible band. The breadth of what they did is astonishing, really. When you look at other jazz groups that have tried to incorporate classical elements in, those classical elements can sometimes swamp it and you lose the jazz. But with the Modern Jazz Quartet, you always feel like they're fiery. It's a perfect balance. You know, I've spoken on this channel so many times about, you know, the balance between sort of hedonism and perfectionism, and when you get that right, it's sublime. And for me, this is a sublime band. And this, recorded in 1974, is recorded beautifully with 1970s recording technology. They're playing at their peak. So this is another album here. If you want to go and check out the Modern Jazz Quartet first album, go and get this. And of course, it has all the classic tunes on. They're a beautiful rendition of Softly as the Morning Sunrise, Summertime. They do bebop. I think they do Confirmation on here, Night in Tunisia. They play Django, Bag's Groove. You've also got tracks like The Golden Skater and The Cylinder. The Cylinder is really shows the brilliance of their composition, and is almost like jazz rock fusion. Before fusion happened, it's such an incredible sound. It goes beyond jazz. As you can tell, I really love this band. Right, so I'm now going to go through a few of the other albums that I grew up with that I really liked. I'm not going to go on for hours, but one of the albums from the sort of classic period of, you know, when they were on Atlantic in the 1950s would be this one. The Modern Jazz Quartet at the Music Inn with guest artist Sonny Rollins. How about that? One of the greatest jazz groups with one of the greatest improvisers in history. You know, Sonny Rollins is still with us. This guy is basically the greatest living improviser on the planet at the moment. You know, Sonny Rollins is an absolute colossus. And so I have never mentioned him on the channel, but he is an incredible player, and he is absolutely fantastic on this album. And on here they do a sort of medley, Stardust, I Can't Get Started, Lover Man, sort of jazz stands. They weave those together, all orchestrated. They do some bebop, Yardbird Suite. You get Bag's Groove, Night in Tunisia. This is a really, really great album, and of course it's live, and I do love the Modern Jazz Quartet live. I've got a lot of the studio stuff, but I think it's because Milt Jackson's just a little bit more unbounded on the live album. So this here is my dad's album. You can see this is an original copy from 1958, I think, is it? What year is this? Yeah, I think, yeah, it's 1958. See, I don't research my videos, you know, I just go for it. Let's have a look at this, because this is an original copy, and this is over 60 years old. Look at that. And look at the perfection of that. My dad really looked after that, because it's a little treasure. This album's a treasure, and I'm very happy to be able to show it you. I've got a ton of my dad's albums going right back to the mid-50s. You know, some of these albums are getting close to 70 years old now. And look at that, and it's all been sellotaped together. It's been played but looked after. There's the back. That's an original copy of the Modern Jazz Quartet, the Music Inn, with Sonny Rollins. That's one of my favourite Modern Jazz Quartet albums. Right, where can we put the other ones? Oh, they're right down here. Right, so two others I want to show you. I absolutely love this album. It's incredible. The Swingle Singers with the Modern Jazz Quartet. So the Swingle Singers are a French a cappella vocal group, and I think they're still going. They were formed 60 years ago, around about 1962, when a bunch of session singers came together, and they were sight singing through a Bach fugue or something like this. And they noticed when they were singing it, they had a very swingy, jazzy sound. So they called themselves the Swingle Singers. And they have this very iconic sound that you've heard in a million 1960s films. That absolutely beautiful. And this is just the best match. That vocal sound with the Modern Jazz Quartet with the vibe. It's absolutely incredible. And this album is absolutely beautiful. It's got Little David's Fugue on it, When I Am Laid to Earth. It's got Vendôme, which is a classic by them. Air on a G-string. Check out Air on a G-string off this album with the Swingle Sisters. It's one of the most beautiful things you will ever hear. Like I said, the Modern Jazz Quartet disbanded in 1974, and then in 1981 they got back together again with the classic lineup. And they did a few albums back then. The second album they released was this, called Echoes, right? and they're back together again. I think it's called, yeah, Together Again, that's the one. All new material on here, and this is them in the studio with 1980s recording technology, because this band, you really need to be able to go in and hear it. It's so subtle. As a 14-year-old kid, I was into like new wave and British heavy metal. My dad was into jazz, and I can remember going down, and I think I bought something like Number of the Beast or something like that, and my dad saw that they got back together. Now I remember him buying this album, and I can remember going back and listening to this album. We listened to this album a lot, so this was an album I listened to a lot in my formative years as a budding musician. I've got a couple of other things here which I want to show you. Milt Jackson did a lot of recordings under his own name with other people, and they're completely different, because Milt's a fiery player. And one album I really like is Milt Jackson and Count Basie, Big Band Volume 1 and Big Band Volume 2, because this is the complete opposite. Count Basie is that dirty, rootsy, swingy, cool, you know, vibe, and Milt just fits in brilliantly with that. This is recorded on Pablo X 1978. It's a really great recording. A lot of these jazz guys, I think people focus on the classic albums of the period of jazz, where actually they were just so powerful as players. When you go to a lot of those Pablo records, I need to do a video on those Pablo records and look at Oscar Peterson, Joe Pass and all those people, the Ella Fitzgerald albums, because they're so well recorded, and these people are just at the height of their powers still, and you can really hear how brilliant they are. I pulled this one out as well. Summit Meeting at Birdland with Charlie Parker. This is the roots of the Modern Jazz Quartet, and on here we've got the lineup of Charlie Parker on alto sax, John Lewis on piano, Curly Russell on bass, Kenny Clark on drums, and Candido on conga. And there we have the beginnings of the Modern Jazz Quartet in the Charlie Parker group. So I hope that gives you a sort of overview. There's one more thing I would like to discuss before we go. When the Modern Jazz Quartet disbanded in '74, Percy Heath formed a band with his brothers, Albert Heath, who was a drummer, and was it Jimmy Heath? I think it's Jimmy Heath. And they were called the Heath Brothers, and they originally signed to Strata East, which was Stanley Cowell's label. Stanley Cowell is a jazz pianist, or was a jazz pianist. He died a couple of years back. And Stanley Cowell also plays thumb piano, and they made an album in 1976 called Marching On, which is this incredible thumb piano jazz with a very African sound, and some of those tracks have got like heavy backbeat and are basically jazz fusion tracks. And so Percy Heath, born in 1923, in the 1970s was making jazz fusion, and I think the reason for that is that if you listen to the Modern Jazz Quartets, for me the roots of fusion are in there because of the way they were bringing all these styles together and the way they were integrating orchestration and sort of classical compositional techniques to create these different structures. This is often called third stream music. It's basically the prog of jazz, you know, and I think if you're a prog fan, then the Modern Jazz Quartet is a really great place to start exploring jazz, because I think you'll enjoy the sort of structure that's there and not have to get bogged down in for endless solos. Often when they're soloing, the soloing is integrated into the orchestration, and yet they're still able to fly. So that is my video on the Modern Jazz Quartet. It's been very personal. I have tried to stick some information in this video, so those of you who are new to this group have learned a little bit, and those of you that know the band and love them, hopefully I've given you a few facts and things that you've enjoyed. So if you like this video, because obviously as you know on my channel I respond to what everybody likes, so if you like it, then like it. If you want to hear more, subscribe and ring the notification bell. If you want to support me in what I'm doing and, you know, chat to me, and I got a whole ton of content. So I got nearly 100 videos up on my Patreon. So if you want to go over there, click on the Patreon link, go and support me. Thanks for watching this video. It's great to talk about jazz, proggers, and I'm sure there's no proggers watching this, it'll be all the jazz guys, but any proggers watching this, thank you for watching these other videos. I really appreciate it, and I will be back with the prog and the jazz fusion very soon. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.